"Take the boys," he said. No one wanted them anyway. Walter Prescott didn't even look at her when he said it. He was looking at his watch. Ruth Tillman stood on her own front porch in the rain, 3 small boys pressed into the folds of her dress, and she did not raise her voice. She lifted her chin. "These are my children," she said. "And one day, Mr. Prescott, they are going to come back for you." He laughed. The deputies didn't. Nobody on that lawn moved, not the neighbors who'd eaten at her table, not the caseworker with her clipboard, not the bankman holding the paper that said the little house on Delaney Road wasn't Ruth's anymore. 22 people stood in the rain and watched a woman lose her whole family in the mud, and not one of them opened their mouth. What Walter Prescott didn't know, what nobody in Belhaven knew, that gray morning was who those 3 discarded boys would grow up to become. Or what they would carry in their pockets for 22 years. Or what they would do the day they finally came home. He thought he'd won something that morning. What he'd actually done was start a clock he couldn't see ticking. Have you ever loved someone the whole world had already decided to throw away? Let me take you back, 24 years earlier, to the day the first boy showed up on Ruth Tillman's porch with everything he owned in a grocery bag. It rained that day too. Belhaven, Georgia was the kind of town that fit on a postcard and not much else. 1 main street, 1 bank, 1 courthouse with a clock that ran 4 minutes slow, 1 diner where the coffee was bad and the pie made up for it. Ruth Tillman lived at the dead end of Delaney Road in a narrow wood frame house her foster mother had left her, with a tin roof that needed work and a porch that sagged on one side like a tired smile. The paint was the color of butter that had gone a little pale. There was a blue tarp over the corner of the roof where the leak was, and there had been a blue tarp there for 9 years, because 9 years was how long Ruth had been meaning to fix it and never quite finding the $1,100 to do it. She was 48 years old that spring. She worked the early shift at Dot's Diner on Main, 6 mornings a week, and took in laundry and mending the rest of the time. She made $4.25 an hour at the diner. She charged $5 for a basket of wash, ironed and folded, and $7 if there was mending in it. On a good week she cleared maybe $90 over what the bills ate. On a bad week she ate beans. She was not a woman the town thought about much. She was the one who pressed your Sunday shirt and your wedding tablecloth and never once told a soul whose stains she'd seen. She was the one who saved you the last slice of peach pie when she knew your week had been hard. She moved through Belhaven the way water moves through a town necessary, quiet, taken for granted, gone before anyone thought to thank it. What the town didn't see was the inside of that little house. The way Ruth ironed every shirt that came to her, even the cheap ones. Even the work shirts that would be filthy again by noon, the way you'd press a wedding dress. Carefully, like it mattered. Like the person who would wear it mattered. That was how her mother had taught her. Not the woman who'd birthed her, the woman who'd raised her. On the back of her bedroom door hung a quilt. You need to remember the quilt. Everything that matters in this story is stitched into it. It was older than Ruth pieced together out of squares that didn't match. A blue gingham square. A square of brown corduroy worn smooth. A square cut from a yellow Easter dress. A square of faded denim with a child's careful crooked initials embroidered in one corner. 31 squares in all, and in the corner of each one, a name and a year stitched in thread that had once been bright. M. 1949, T. 1951, Junior 1956, 31 names. 31 children. The woman who made that quilt was named Pearl Tillman, and she had taken in 31 children no one else would have. Ruth was the 11th square. Ruthie, 1948, she'd been 7 years old, mute with grief, handed off at a county office like a parcel nobody had paid postage on. Pearl had looked at her, this skinny, silent, throwaway child, and said the words Ruth would spend the rest of her life living inside of. "You don't get to choose who needs you," Pearl had said. "You only get to choose what you do about it." But we'll get to Pearl.
First, you have to meet the boys. The first one came in the spring. His name was Marcus, and he was 9 years old, and he was furious.
He'd been through 5 homes in 3 years and learned the only lesson 5 homes will teach a boy: love is a thing people give back. He came up Ruth's walk with his fists already balled, daring her to want him so he could enjoy not being wanted. He had a paper grocery sack with one shirt, one pair of pants, and a broken toy car in it. He stood on her sagging porch and said, "I'm not staying." Ruth looked at him a long moment. Then she said, "All right. But you'll be hungry by 6. Supper's at 6 whether you're staying or not." He stayed. The second one came that summer, Isaiah, 7 years old and so quick you had to count the spoons after he left a room. They called him a thief at the agency. What he was a child who had learned that the only food you can count on is the food you've already hidden. Ruth found 3 biscuits under his mattress the first week, and 4 the second, and she never said a word about it. She just started leaving a little tin on the windowsill with crackers in it, and she let him think she didn't know. By winter the tin sat empty and he ate at the table like the rest of them. They called him Zay. The third one came in the fall, and the third one didn't speak at all. His name was Daniel. He was 5. Something had happened to Daniel before he came to Delaney Road. The file had 3 blacked-out lines and a phrase Ruth read once and then never let herself read again, and after it happened, Daniel had simply stopped talking. 6 placements had sent him back. Unresponsive, the file said. Recommend institutional care. They meant the county home out past the highway, the one with the chain link and the smell. They were going to send a 5-year-old there because he was quiet. Ruth drove out to the agency in her dying Buick and signed for him. The caseworker, a tired, kind woman named Gloria, said, "Ruth, this one's going to be hard. I won't lie to you." Ruth said, "The easy ones don't end up in your office, Gloria." She brought Danny home, and she did not try to make him talk. She just kept him near. He sat on the kitchen floor while she ironed, and she narrated her whole day to him in a low, warm voice, the diner, the gossip, the man who tipped in dimes, and she never once asked him to answer. It took 4 months. One morning she was singing under her breath, an old hymn her mother used to sing, and from the kitchen floor a small, cracked voice joined in on the second line. Just for a second, Ruth kept ironing. She didn't look down. She didn't make it a thing. But that night she went into her room, and she got out the quilt, and she got out her needle, and by lamplight she stitched 3 new squares. Marcus, 1989, Isaiah, 1989, Daniel, 1989, 34 children. Pearl's 31, and now Ruth's 3. She didn't have much. She fed 4 people on a diner wage and a laundry basket. The boys wore clothes from the church box and shoes a half size too big to grow into. Breakfast went to school in a brown paper bag, and Ruth had a way of folding the top of that bag so neat it looked like a present. There was the blue tarp over the leek and beans at the end of the month, and 1 bicycle the 3 of them shared by a system of fights and treaties. But here is what those 3 boys had on Delaney Road that they had never had anywhere on this earth before. They had somebody who would not give them back. Marcus stopped balling his fists. Zay stopped hiding biscuits. Danny started talking, and then he started reading, and then he started reading everything: cereal boxes, the backs of medicine bottles, the medical encyclopedia, the church box coughed up one Christmas, which he read 3 times. Marcus took apart the toaster and put it back together better. Zay could talk a county clerk out of a late fee and a teacher out of detention. The boy was 9 kinds of lawyer before he was 9 years old. Ruth saw it. She saw exactly what those boys were. The town saw 3 strays in hand me-down shoes. Ruth saw an architect, an attorney, and a doctor sitting at her kitchen table eating beans, and she fed them like she knew it. "You are not what happened to you," she told them every single night, like grace before bed. "You are what you do next." Now, while all of that warmth was growing at the dead end of Delaney Road, you need to understand who owned the other end of town. Walter Prescott III owned the bank. He owned the bank his father had owned and his grandfather had founded, Prescott Savings and Loan, the only place in 3 counties to get a mortgage or a small business loan or, God help you, a second chance. He sat on the county commission. He sat on the hospital board. His brother-in-law was the magistrate judge. His cousin ran the very welfare agency that placed children, which is a detail you'll want to hold on to. The Belhaven Courier was printed on a press the Prescott family had bought for the editor in 1961, and the editor had been deeply grateful and softly silent ever since. Walter Prescott did not raise his voice either. He'd never had to. When you own the money, the paper, the judge, and the loans, you can say cruel things very quietly and watch a whole town pretend it didn't hear. He had a plan that spring, did Walter Prescott. He called it Prescott Commons. A shopping plaza, a country club, $40 million of development on the cheap flat land at the south end of town, and the cheap flat land at the south end of town ran right up to the dead end of Delaney Road, to the narrow house with the tin roof and the blue tarp, to Ruth Tillman's half-acre, which she owned outright, free and clear, the one thing Pearl had left her that nobody could take. The one thing. Hold on to that, too. Prescott offered to buy it. He sent a man in a nice car with a check for $3,000 and a smile like a closed drawer. Ruth made the man a glass of sweet tea and thanked him for coming and said the house was not for sale. He offered 5. She said no. He offered 8 and added through his man that it would be a shame, a real shame, if a woman in her circumstances were to find that circumstances got worse. Ruth said no, and Walter Prescott stopped offering and started arranging. Because men like Walter Prescott do not buy what they can take. But what Walter Prescott didn't know, and this is the thing, this is the whole thing, was that he had picked the one fight in Belhaven that would not stay quiet. Because the woman at the dead end of Delaney Road had spent her entire life learning, square by square, exactly how to lose everything and keep her dignity. And she had 3 boys watching her do it. Watch what he does next. You'll want to remember every move. It started with the taxes. Ruth's property taxes ran about $112 a year, and she paid them every January, in cash, at the courthouse window. That winter she went to pay, and the clerk, a nervous young man who wouldn't meet her eye, told her there had been a reassessment. The land had been rezoned for its highest and best use, which is a phrase that means we have decided your home is worth what it's worth to a rich man. Her taxes were now $1,840. She didn't have $1,840. There was not $1,840 on the whole of Delaney Road. She got a payment plan. Then the payment plan got a clerical error. Then there was a lien, filed by Prescott Savings and Loan, who had somehow, on paper Ruth had never signed, become the holder of a note against the property. The magistrate judge, Prescott's brother-in-law, signed the order in 11 minutes. 90 days, the paper said. 90 days to pay $1,840 or the county would sell the house at auction on the courthouse steps. 90 days. And the very same week, because cruelty likes to travel in pairs, a complaint was filed with the county welfare agency, the agency run by Prescott's cousin. The complaint said that the 3 minor children residing at the Delaney Road address were living in substandard, unsafe conditions with an elderly single woman of limited means. It cited the leaking roof, it cited the beans, it cited, God forgive them, the fact that the boys shared one bicycle. Gloria, the tired, kind caseworker, came out to the house with tears already standing in her eyes, because she knew exactly what was happening and exactly who was doing it and exactly how little she could stop it. Ruth, she whispered on the porch, they've already signed the removal order. I'm so sorry. I fought it. I lost. Ruth Tillman, who had raised herself out of a county office and 3 other people out of 3 sacks, stood very still and asked one question. When? Tomorrow morning. That night she did not cry where the boys could see. She made their favorite supper fried chicken, which she could not afford, paid for out of the coffee tin where she kept the roof money she'd never managed to save, and she let them eat until they were full and laughing, and Danny told a long impossible story about a frog, and Zay corrected every detail, and Marcus pretended to be above it all and wasn't. She sat at the head of her own table at the dead end of Delaney Road, and she burned that picture into her own eyes so she'd have it for the long years coming. Then she put them to bed. And then she sat up the whole night with her needle and her lamp. The morning came gray and wet. They came in 3 cars. The county car for the boys. The deputy's car, because Prescott liked a uniform present to make the cruel thing look like the law. And Walter Prescott's own long silver Lincoln, because he'd come to watch. He didn't have to come. That's the part that tells you who he was. The eviction and the removal were going to happen whether he stood on that lawn or not. But Walter Prescott came and stood under his black umbrella at the dead end of Delaney Road on a Tuesday morning to watch a laundress lose her children, and he checked his watch while he did it because he had a 10 o'clock. The neighbors came out onto their porches, 22 of them, all told. The Hendersons. Old Mr. Cobb, the Davis family whose tablecloths Ruth had pressed for free for 30 years. They stood and they watched and they said nothing because Walter Prescott owned their mortgages too, and silence is the rent that fear pays. The deputies carried the furniture out and set it on the wet grass. The bed, the kitchen chairs, the little dresser. They handled it the way you handle another person's whole life when it isn't yours carelessly. And from inside the house a young deputy came out with his arms full of bedding and bath towels and, on the top of the pile, folded soft the quilt. He didn't know what it was. To him it was a rag. He had his orders to clear the house, and he was wet and uncomfortable and wanted to be done, and so he did what a man does with an armful of rags he doesn't want. He dropped it. The Quilt Pearls quilt, 34 children, 70 years, every name, Ruthie 1948, Marcus Isaiah Daniel 1989, fell off the pile and landed in the mud at the bottom of the porch steps, in a puddle the color of weak coffee, and the deputy stepped over it to go back for more. Ruth made a sound, just one, small, and Walter Prescott looked down at the thing in the mud, this filthy patchwork rag at the foot of the steps, and he nudged it with the toe of his polished shoe, pushing it deeper into the puddle. And he said quietly, to no one, the way you'd comment on the weather, throw that on the truck with the rest of the trash. That was the moment. You felt it, didn't you? That was the moment the whole story turned on, the line that could not be uncrossed. Ruth Tillman walked down her own porch steps in the rain, past the deputy, past Walter Prescott and his umbrella, and she knelt in the mud in her good Sunday dress, the one she'd put on that morning so she'd face this with dignity, and she lifted the quilt out of the puddle with both hands. She held it the way a knight kisses the hand of a queen, the way you hold something precious, the way you hold the only thing you have left of every person who ever loved you. She did not scream at him. She did not weep at him. She rose, soaked to the skin, mud to her elbows, and she looked Walter Prescott dead in the eyes, calm as still water, and she said the words you heard at the very beginning. These are my children, and one day they are going to come back for you. And he laughed. Then they put the boys in the county car. Marcus, 11 now and rigid with the effort of not crying, because crying gives them what they want. Zay, who tried 3 different arguments on the caseworker and watched all 3 fail and went silent for the first time in years. And Danny, who had not spoken when he came and had learned to speak in that house. Danny, who was 7 now. Danny pressed his face to the car window, and his mouth was moving, and no sound was coming out, and Ruth understood that the world had finally frightened the words back out of him. She ran to the car. A deputy moved to stop her, and Gloria, the caseworker, stepped in front of him, the one brave thing anyone did that day, and Ruth got to the window. She had spent the night with her needle. From a hidden inside corner of the quilt where it would never show, she had cut 3 small squares of cloth, and on each she had stitched a single word, and she had hemmed the raw edges so they would not fray, so they would last. She pressed one into each boy's hand through the gap in the window. Marcus's square said brave. Zay's square said sharp, and little Danny's square, the boy who had no words, said simply mine. You listen to me, Ruth said through the glass, fast, because they were starting the engine. You are not what happened to you today, you hear me? You are what you do next. I will be here, wherever they put you, however long it takes, I will be right here at the end of this road, and you come home. You hear me? You come home. The car pulled away down Delaney Road. 3 small faces in the back window, 3 small hands holding 3 small squares of an old woman's quilt. And Ruth Tillman stood in the mud and the rain in front of 22 silent neighbors and 1 laughing rich man, and she did not fall down. She had 90 days. The clock was running. Remember that number. But to understand why Ruth Tillman could lose everything she owned and not lose herself, to understand where a poor laundress finds the kind of spine that does not bend in front of a man who owns the town, you have to go back further than the boys. You have to go back to a different rainy day in 1948 and a different throwaway child standing on a different porch. Her name then was just Ruthie. She was 7. Her mother had died of a fever in a county that didn't have a hospital for people like them, and her father had walked into a cotton mill one morning in 1947 and never walked out, and the machine that took him paid his daughter nothing, because the machine belonged to a family named Prescott. Yes, that family. The mill had been the grandfather's. The blood in the gears that made the money that built the bank that bought the town some of it was Ruthie's father's. Belhaven was built on the backs of people Belhaven never named. So Ruthie went to the county office, a parcel with no postage, and she stopped talking the way Danny would stop talking 40 years later, because grief runs in the same grooves no matter the decade, and the county decided that a silent colored orphan was an institutional case. The home passed the highway, the chain link, and the smell, and a woman named Pearl Tillman drove out in a dying car and signed for her. Pearl was a laundress. Of course she was. Pearl pressed the town's shirts and took in its mending and lived at the dead end of Delaney Road in a narrow house with a tin roof, and Pearl had already raised 10 children no one wanted, and the town thought Pearl was a fool. You can't save them all, they told her. You can't even save yourself, Pearl Tillman. And Pearl would say, every time, the words she eventually said to Ruthie on the porch in the rain, "You don't get to choose who needs you. You only get to choose what you do about it." Pearl taught Ruthie to read by the medical encyclopedia and the Bible, in that order, because Pearl said the first one would keep your children alive, and the second one would keep your heart from dying. Pearl taught her to iron a work shirt like a wedding dress. Pearl taught her that calm is not weakness, that the loudest person in the room is almost always the most frightened, and that stillness, real stillness, is the rarest kind of power there is. Let them yell, Pearl said. A still pond shows you the sky, a loud one just shows you mud. And Pearl made a quilt, a square for every child. She'd started it with her first, and she added to it with each one, and she told Ruthie that the quilt was the only deed that mattered. The bank can take the house, Pearl said, stitching by lamplight, the very lamp Ruth would one day sew the 3 squares by. The county can take the land, let them. This, and she'd smoothed the quilt, this is the only thing I own that they can't sell, because it isn't worth a dime to anybody but the people in it. That's how you know what's precious, baby. It's the thing the bank doesn't want. Pearl died in 1979. Ruth held her hand at the end. The last thing Pearl said, almost too quiet to hear, was, "Did I do enough?" And Ruth had said, "Mama, you did everything." She inherited the house, free and clear. She inherited the iron and the lamp and the needle. And she inherited the quilt with its 31 squares and the unfinished corner where Pearl had been about to start the 32nd before the machine of her own tired heart ran out. Now do you understand? When Walter Prescott pushed that quilt into the mud with his polished shoe, he wasn't ruining a rag. He was spitting on 70 years and 34 souls. He was, though he would never in his life have the wit to know it, defiling the one thing a Prescott had already tried to destroy once before, 2 generations back in a cotton mill. He thought he was clearing a lot for a parking garage. He had no idea he had just declared war on a quilt. The boys were scattered. Marcus to a group home 2 counties over. Zay to a family in Macon. Danny, silent again, recommend institutional care again, was headed for the home past the highway, the very fate Pearl had once driven through the rain to spare a different silent child. But Gloria, the caseworker, the one who'd stepped in front of the deputy, did one more brave thing. She pulled Danny's file, and she lost it for 9 days in the bottom of a drawer, and in those 9 days she found a young doctor and his wife in Atlanta who'd been waiting 2 years to foster, and she got Danny to them before Prescott's cousin noticed. And that doctor and his wife looked at a mute, terrified 7-year-old and saw exactly what Ruth had seen, a boy who read medical encyclopedias for fun, a healer. Ruth never got the house. She missed the 90 days by $1,100 the cost, almost to the penny, of the roof she'd never fixed, and Prescott's savings and loan bought it on the courthouse steps at auction for the back taxes, and then the county quietly transferred the lot into the Prescott Commons parcel, and a bulldozer knocked Pearl's narrow house flat in an afternoon. Ruth stood across the street and watched the tin roof fold. She had moved into a single room above Dot's diner. Dot had given it to her for nothing and dared anyone to say a word. The town moved on. The town always moves on. Walter Prescott broke ground on Prescott Commons. The Courier ran a photo of him with a gold shovel. People said it was a shame about Ruth, and then they said it less, and then they stopped saying it, and the years closed over the dead end of Delaney Road like water over a stone. But 3 boys did not forget. You don't get to see the years between. That's the cruel arithmetic of it. 22 years happened in the dark, in 3 different cities, in 3 different lives, and Ruth lived every one of them in that little room above the diner with the quilt folded on the foot of her bed, writing letters that came back stamped no longer at this address, never once knowing if the boys were alive, never once stopping the letters. But the boys were doing something in those years. They were becoming exactly what she'd told them they were. Marcus kept the square that said Brave in his wallet, behind his learner's permit, then his license, then his union card, then his first business card. He went into construction at 16, framing houses. He had a gift for it could see a building finished before the foundation was poured, the way some men hear a whole song from one note. By 30, he had his own firm. By 35, Tillman Development was building in 4 states. He never changed his name. Tillman. He kept her name like a flag. Zay kept the square that said Sharp taped inside his first law textbook. He'd talked his way into a scholarship, then law school, then a clerkship, and he never lost a courtroom the way he'd never lost a county clerk. By the time this story comes back around, he was a federal prosecutor with a specialty that should make you smile: financial fraud. Public corruption. Men who use banks and judges and zoning boards to take things from people who can't fight back. Zay had spent 20 years learning in precise legal detail exactly how to take apart a man like Walter Prescott. He just didn't know yet that the man had a name, and Danny, who had no words, became a surgeon, a pediatric surgeon, the kind who operates on children too small for the machines. And he was good. He was the best in the Southeast, and the families who handed him their dying babies said the thing that always got said about Dr. Daniel was that he was so calm, so still, that his stillness made you believe everything would be all right. He'd learned that on a kitchen floor, listening to a low, warm voice narrate a whole ordinary day to a boy who couldn't yet answer. He kept the square that said Mine in a silver frame on his desk where the families couldn't see it, but he could. 3 boys no one wanted: an architect, an attorney, and a doctor. And in the spring of 2013, 22 years after a silver Lincoln idled at the dead end of Delaney Road, Marcus Tillman opened the Belhaven Courier online. He had it set to alert him. Had for years a single search term, the name of a town, and he read that the Prescott family was holding a grand reopening. Prescott Commons had failed, you see. It always fails, that kind of thing, built on cheap land and cheaper conscience. The country club had gone bankrupt. The plaza sat half empty. But Walter Prescott, older now, grayer, but the same closed-drawer smile, had cooked up one last deal. He was selling the whole parcel, the failed commons and the empty lots, to a national developer in a ribbon cutting on the courthouse steps. 40 acres, a check that would set the Prescott family up for another 2 generations. 10 o'clock on a Saturday morning. The mayor would be there, the new Courier editor. The whole town. The same courthouse steps. Marcus called Zay. Zay called Danny. They didn't need to discuss it for long. They'd been waiting 22 years, and they'd each, in their own way, gotten very good at exactly the thing this would require. She always said we'd come back for him, Marcus said. Then we go get her first, said Danny, who didn't waste words. They found her in 19 minutes. She wasn't hard to find. She was exactly where she said she'd be, not the dead end of Delaney Road, that was gone, but in Belhaven, in the little room above Dot's Diner, 72 years old now, still pressing shirts, still folding the tops of bags so neat they looked like presents, still waiting. There's a clock running now, too, and Walter Prescott can't see this one either. It's 10 o'clock Saturday morning. 11 o'clock is when the check gets signed. He has 1 hour. Remember that number. The courthouse steps were crowded that bright Saturday. The mayor was there in a good suit. The Courier photographer was there. The National Developers people were there with the big cardboard check and the scissors and the red ribbon. And Walter Prescott was there, 78 years old, leaning on a silver-handled cane, basking, telling the story he'd told for 50 years about 3 generations of Prescotts, and the vision it took to build a town. At 3 minutes to 10, 3 black cars came down Main Street and stopped at the foot of the courthouse steps. A tall man got out of the first one. Expensive suit, easy power, the unhurried walk of a man who has built things that will outlast him. Marcus Tillman. A second man got out of the second car, with a briefcase and the flat patient eyes of a prosecutor who has already read all of your mail. Isaiah Tillman. And from the third car stepped a quiet man with gray at his temples and a doctor's stillness, and he went around to the passenger side and he opened the door and he helped an old woman out into the sunlight. Ruth Tillman climbed the courthouse steps on the arm of the boy who used to have no words. She wore her good Sunday dress, and over both her arms, folded soft and clean and whole, she carried a quilt. Walter Prescott didn't recognize them at first. Why would he? He'd thrown away children. He had no reason to remember the faces. He saw 3 well-dressed strangers and an old black woman climbing his courthouse steps, and he turned to a deputy. There's always a deputy to have them moved along. Then Marcus Tillman stepped up beside the big cardboard check, and he turned to face the crowd, and he said, in a voice built to carry across construction sites, before anybody signs anything, the town might want to hear who's actually buying this land. The murmur went through the crowd. The National Developers man frowned and checked his folder. My name is Marcus Tillman, Marcus said. 2 weeks ago, my company outbid the buyers standing behind me, quietly through 3 shell companies, because I learned how to be quiet from the best there is. He looked at Ruth. As of Thursday, Tillman Development owns this parcel, all 40 acres, the failed commons, the empty lots, and 1 lot in particular, a half-acre at the dead end of what used to be Delaney Road. Walter Prescott's hand tightened on his cane. You may not remember us, Mr. Prescott, Marcus went on. We were small, we came in grocery bags. 22 years ago you stood on a lawn in the rain and you told a deputy to throw our home on a truck with the trash. You told a woman that nobody wanted us. He paused. The whole courthouse square had gone silent. Silent the way that lawn had gone silent, except this silence had teeth. Well, here we are. The strays came back. And that's when Walter Prescott's face did the thing. You've been waiting for it. The color drained out of it the way water drains out of a cracked basin. His mouth opened and nothing came out. His hand on the cane was shaking. Because he was looking, finally, at the 3 small faces from the back window of a county car, grown into 3 of the most powerful men in the state of Georgia, and behind them, calm as still water, the woman who'd told him exactly this would happen and laughed at by him for saying it. Then Isaiah Tillman opened his briefcase. I'm a federal prosecutor, Mr. Prescott, Zay said, and his voice was the gentlest thing on those steps, which is what made it terrifying. Public corruption is my specialty. Banks, judges, zoning boards. Men who reassess a widow's land from $100 to $1,800, file a lien on a note she never signed, and get it stamped in 11 minutes by a magistrate who happens to be married to their sister. He lifted a thick folder. We've been gathering documents for 14 months. The reassessment fraud. The forged note. Your cousin's signature on a removal order that cited a leaking roof as child endangerment. In the same month, your bank refused that same woman an $1,100 home repair loan. It's all here. It's all going to the U.S. Attorney's Office Monday morning. He closed the briefcase. I just wanted to hand it to you in person first. Professional courtesy. One lawyer to whatever you are. The mayor had backed away from Prescott as if from something contagious. The Courier photographer was taking pictures so fast it sounded like rain. And someone in the crowd, a young woman near the front, had her phone up, had had it up the whole time, recording everything, and that phone, that little glass rectangle, was about to do more to Walter Prescott than any judge. But it was Danny who finished it. The one who had no words. He stepped forward, the surgeon, the still one, and he didn't raise his voice, because Pearl was right, the still pond shows you the sky. He looked at Walter Prescott, and then he looked at Ruth, and he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small square of cloth, hemmed at the edges so it would last, and on it a single word stitched by lamplight 2 years before. Mine. Marcus took out his. Brave. Zay took out his. Sharp. And Ruth Tillman, 72 years old, unfolded the quilt over the courthouse railing in the morning sun, 34 squares, every name, every year, and one corner where 3 squares had been carefully cut away long ago and the edges left raw and waiting, and her 3 sons stepped forward and laid their 3 squares back into the empty corner where they belonged. The quilt was whole. "You see, Mr. Prescott," Ruth said, and it was the first time she'd spoken, and the square went silent to hear her. "The loud one always goes silent for the still one in the end. You can take a house. You can take the land. I always knew that. My mother told me that before you were grown. But there's one thing the bank never wanted, because it isn't worth a dime to anybody but the people in it." She smoothed the quilt with one hand the way Pearl used to, and that's the only thing that was ever worth a thing. She didn't laugh at him. She wasn't that kind. She just looked at him with something almost like pity, which is worse than anything, and she said, "I told you they'd come home." Walter Prescott sat down hard on the courthouse steps and did not get up. The young woman's phone video went up that night. By Sunday, it had 400,000 views. By Monday, when Isaiah Tillman walked the folder into the U.S. Attorney's office in Atlanta, it had 9 million, and a hashtag had grown up around the cruelest thing Walter Prescott ever said, the line he'd murmured into the rain like a comment on the weather. Hashtag nobody wanted them. People put it under videos of their own foster parents, their own grandmothers, the teacher who didn't give up. 500,000 people typed those 3 words and turned them inside out until a phrase meant to throw children away became the name of every person who'd ever caught one. The reckoning came the way water comes through a town. Slow, and then all at once. The forged note was real, and a federal forensic accountant proved it in a deposition that lasted 4 hours and ended Walter Prescott's career in the first 40 minutes. The magistrate judged the brother-in-law resigned before the Bar Association could move, which spared him nothing, he was disbarred anyway, in a unanimous vote the next spring. Prescott's cousin, who ran the welfare agency, was indicted on 14 counts related to the falsified removal orders, and the investigation that started with Ruth turned up 19 other families the same machine had ground up over the years, 19 other homes cleared, 19 other lots that had ended up, by remarkable coincidence, inside a Prescott development. The bank failed. Prescott Savings and Loan, founded by a grandfather on cotton mill money, 90 years old, was seized by federal regulators in the autumn and its assets sold for pennies. And here is a thing Ruth never asked for and would not have asked for: the largest single bidder for those assets, the entity that bought the building on Main Street where the bank had stood for 90 years, was Tillman Development. Marcus did not turn it into a bank. The civil suits came too. The state of Georgia settled the wrongful removal claims with the 19 families and with Ruth, and the number that landed in the paper was $4.2 million. Ruth received the largest share. She looked at the check a long while. Then she signed every dollar of it over to something she was already building, and we'll get to that because that's the part that matters. That's the part Pearl would have cared about. Walter Prescott himself pleaded out, in the end. Old men with good lawyers usually do. He didn't go to prison. The doctors said his heart wouldn't survive it, the same heart that had idled in a silver Lincoln on a rainy Tuesday so he could watch. He paid a fine that took most of what was left, and he signed a confession, and he lived out his last few years in a house that was suddenly too big, in a town that suddenly knew exactly what he was, walking down Main Street past the building where his bank used to be, and reading every single day the new sign over the door. Because here is what the 3 boys did with the bank. Go back for a second. Go back to the moment Danny pressed his face to the car window 22 years before, his mouth moving and no sound coming out. Watch that boy. Now watch the man he became, standing in the lobby of the building that broke his mother, holding a pair of scissors. They named it the Pearl Tillman home. Pearl, the first name. The first one who drove through the rain to sign for a child the world had thrown away. The old bank building, 90 years of foreclosures and liens and reassessments, and that closed-drawer smile became a children's home and family services center, the best funded in the state, with a clinic on the second floor where Dr. Daniel Tillman operates 2 weekends a month for free, and a legal aid office on the third floor where a federal prosecutor's old colleagues volunteer to fight the exact kind of machine that once fought a laundress, and over the whole thing 3 Tillman brothers and a board of the 19 families and $12 million to start, with more every year. The marble lobby of the old bank, where men in nice cars had handed an old woman checks to make her go away, they hung the quilt there. Whole, behind glass, in the light, where every frightened child who comes through those doors can see it, 34 squares. And a small brass plaque underneath that doesn't explain it, because the people who need to understand it understand it. It just says, you don't get to choose who needs you, you only get to choose what you do about it. Pearl Tillman, who chose. 1 year later, on a warm spring evening, they held the first graduation. Not a real school graduation, a different kind. The Pearl Tillman home had taken in its first dozen children that no one else would have, and one of them, a furious 9-year-old boy who'd come in with his fists balled and one shirt in a grocery sack, had stopped balling his fists. He stood up in the marble lobby under the quilt and read a poem he'd written, badly, beautifully, and when he finished he looked at the old woman in the front row, 73 now, who'd insisted on pressing all the children's shirts herself for the occasion, every one of them ironed like a wedding dress, and he didn't have the words for what he wanted to say, so he just walked over and put his head against her shoulder. And Ruth Tillman, who had been a parcel with no postage, who had been thrown away, who had been caught, who had caught 3 others, who had lost everything to a man with a polished shoe and gotten back something he could never have understood, Ruth put her arm around that furious, frightened, precious boy, and she said the only thing she'd ever known to say. The thing Pearl said. The thing she'd said through a car window in the rain. "You are not what happened to you, baby," she told him. "You are what you do next." And the quilt watched from the wall, with 3 squares back where they belonged, and a little space in the corner. There's always a little space in the corner waiting for the next name. If this story moved you the way it moved me, do me one small kindness like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe, because we tell these stories every week, the ones about the people the world tried to throw away and couldn't. And before you go, sit with this one question: who, in your whole life, was the pearl who caught you when you were falling? Tell me about them in the comments. Say their name. Let's fill the comments tonight with the names of the people who chose us. But here's what really gets me about this whole thing. It isn't the bank. It isn't the courtroom, or the verdict, or the day a rich man sat down hard on the courthouse steps and couldn't get up. Those are just the noise. What gets me is a poor woman, the night before she lost everything, sitting up alone by a lamp with a needle, cutting 3 small squares from the only thing she had left in the world, and instead of holding on tighter, she gave them away. She gave away pieces of the one thing she loved, to 3 children she might never see again, so that wherever the world scattered them, they would always be able to put their hand in their pocket and feel the proof that once, for a while, they were somebody's, that they were brave, that they were sharp, that they were hers. She didn't know they'd come back. She couldn't have known. She did it anyway. That's the whole thing. That's the only thing. Love that expects nothing is the only love that ever changes anything. So let me ask you the harder question, the real one, the one I want you to answer honestly tonight before you sleep. Forget who caught you. Here's what I want to know. Who's falling past you right now today, this week, that you could catch? Who's the throwaway child, the silent one, the furious one, the one everybody's already decided about, that's sitting at the edge of your life, waiting for one person to fold the top of the bag down neat like it's a present? Because you don't get to choose who needs you. You only ever get to choose what you do about it. Tell me in the comments. I'll be reading every single one.